And the story that they told me, Porter Goss's assistants told me, is that they interviewed dozens of senior managers in the analytic directorate, of which I was now one. He said, they told me that you were the only one who said that there were real problems with intelligence analysis. I'm just quoting what they said. And I was like, really? How can that be? How could I be the only one? So that's how I became deputy director of analysis.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the pod. It's a very special edition of the podcast today. I'd like to introduce a very special guest, a lady called Carmen Medina, as a retired senior federal executive with over 34 years experience in the Intel community. And she's a former deputy director of Intel at CIA and the director of the Center of the Study of Intelligence. She's a recognized national and international expert on intelligence analysis, strategic thinking, diversity of thought, and innovation. And she's also the co-author of a great book, Rebels at Work, a handbook for leading change from within. She has a lot of content out on the internet. I can't recommend that content enough. And so we'll just crack on with the show. So welcome, Carmen.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Good afternoon. I know it's afternoon out there. And Howard, how are you?
Great to see you. And the chance to have a face-to-face conversation with you is gold to me. It's one of my bucket list moments, so I'm delighted. Welcome.
Thank you.
Likewise, is the kind of the unofficial UK fan club, I think. So, Carmen, do you mind, for our listeners, just maybe taking us just on your journey, just how you got into the whole Intel thing and just your journey throughout and where you got hit? Small question, I guess, but if you don't mind, just take us on that journey.
Well, I'll do my best. I often get asked the question, did you always want to work for the CIA? And the answer is no. I'm Puerto Rican. That's my heritage. I was born in Puerto Rico. Technically, Spanish is my first language, but I've never really studied it or used it professionally. It's not the language I'm most comfortable in. I am an Army brat, which I don't know if that translates into...
It does.
Great Britain. So my dad was a sergeant in the Army, and we lived all over. I don't think I spent more than 2 years at any school up until the time I was 11. And that included... Well, actually, this was the longest, a 2.5-year stint in Germany, where I picked up my third language, very rusty now, Deutsch. I ended up somehow being a good student. I'm not really sure why. I mean, it's a mystery to all of us, how our cognitive skills develop, I think. And when I went to high school, actually, this is a great story, so I'll tell it. In the 8th grade, which in the American system is your last grade before you go on to what we call high school. In the 8th grade, I had this teacher whom I didn't particularly like. I didn't have warm and fuzzies about her, Mrs. Bunsen, who I guess on the last day of class said to me, Carmen, you're going to high school and you're really smart, but English was not your first language. And so you speak too fast and too loud. It's just a physiological artifact of Spanish being your first language. So take speech when you go to high school because it'll help you with that. So I did. And that I learned by taking speech that I was very good at argumentation and debate. So now the first link is created in this story. And when you're a debater in high school and college, you naturally think you're going to be a lawyer. In the U.S., that's the natural progression, or a barrister, an attorney. And so I ended up on the East Coast going to a university called Catholic University in the district on the full tuition debate scholarship. And that university had lawyers. And so I started meeting lawyers and I realized I did not want to be like them. What was I reacting to? Well, they were, at that time, late 70s, they were mostly men. They were pretentious, I felt. They overly serious. And the big technology at that time was digital watches. The watch face was just numbers, and they were overly attached to their novelty of their digital watches. So I searched around, well, what am I going to do now? Luckily, I'm in DC, and the only other thing I'm interested in is the world. By which I mean the fact that there is a world, that it's composed of all these different cultures. I personally experienced, cultural differences in a very significant way. And so I applied just to one school, Georgetown, for their master's in foreign service, and I got in. My dad was a sergeant in the Army. My mother, at that time, had never gone to university. She ended up in her 40s getting a degree. But so I didn't have any kind of cultural or family background to draw upon. So went to Georgetown, and I tell people, if you want a career at the CIA, the best thing you can do is go to a university where the CIA recruits a lot. And that is Georgetown University. They come all the time. They showed up my first semester. They liked me. I interviewed. I got in. And that is the sum total of my story. I got in as a summer intern, which is a 90-day limited contract, but you get fully cleared. And that's one of the best ways to join the intelligence community, through that internship, because the intelligence community is not for everyone. And it's a good way to, test drive it. I, at the end of my 90 days, so this was the summer in between my first and second year at grad school, they say, hey, we like you. Why don't you just stay full time? And so I did. So I never quite got my master's from Georgetown. I ended up being 2 incompletes short of it. Because I tried, I started work and tried to finish it at the same time. This was 1978, and I spent 32 years physically at CIA. So I retired in 2010. At the time, the analytic program was small, certainly compared to what it is now, and kind of traumatized from the experience of Vietnam. All these analysts, so I joined 78, Vietnam is just a few years past us. The analysts kind of had seen Vietnam for what it was, likely impossible situation to win. But they were not listened to. They were dismissed. Some of them, it became so traumatic that they left the agency. Many of them were bitter. Sort of, if you think about it, all my mentors, the people that were training me at the beginning, were all people that had been very embittered, for the most part, by this Vietnam experience. Just kind of interesting. This is the Jimmy Carter administration. Stansfield Turner is the director of CIA, and the CIA is not just traumatized by Vietnam, but traumatized by the Senate hearings on all of the things that the CIA had been doing that were totally illegal or wrong, like involvement with U.S. Citizens or U.S. persons, various assassination attempts, just a litany of stupid covert operations, just a litany of things. So the CIA was traumatized by that as well. I started off working in the operations center, just exactly what it sounds like, 24-hour watch office. And then they recruit me after a year to work on Africa. I didn't know anything about Africa. That was okay, because pretty much everyone who worked on Africa didn't know anything about it, because it was not a place that was considered important to U.S. interests. But it was kind of at that time that it was becoming more important, because we realized that Cuba and the Soviet Union were sort of fighting proxy skirmishes in the Cold War in places such as Angola. I spent about 3 years working on Southern Africa. By the way, you were talking about my content being available. I run a YouTube channel called Pandas Playing Cello, and our most recent interview is with a colleague, with someone who was a colleague during the South African times in the 1980s. And so we reminisce a lot about that period. I think the conversation is really good. And I did that for about 3 or 4 years. All organizations are mismanaged in equally the same way. One of the things I learned after I retired from CIA, pretty much I had worked before I went to CIA, but in little jobs, like a secretary or whatever, flipping burgers. And after I left CIA and started working for other large organizations, I realized that all the things I thought were uniquely stupid about CIA were not unique at all. They were all just symptoms of large organization disease. So for whatever reasons, I got disenchanted with my management in South Africa, and I was pretty good. My background as a debater and argumentation is the one thing I can point to specifically that helped me be a good intelligence analyst. Because in the American debate, high school collegiate debate, you either have to take the negative or the positive on any particular issue based on the flip of a coin. And so there might be, let's say, 100 arguments around that topic, sub-arguments you could make. And we had to, as debaters, we had to know the inside and the outside, the pro and the con, the good and the bad of every single argument. And it's hard for me to think of a training that is more relevant to being an intelligence analyst than that experience. So the Middle East office came looking for me because they were always looking for analysts. We didn't have enough. So I got poached, and then I went to work on the Middle East for 3 years, and I worked on Lebanon and the Palestinian issue. I worked on Lebanon the year that everything went horrible in Lebanon, with 240 plus Marines were killed in Beirut. In fact, I was awakened around 3:00 in the morning when that happened and told that I had to come into work immediately. And so it was summer. I put on clothes, but I still had my flip-flops on. And I spent, because I was trying to save any moment. And I spent the whole day at CIA briefing everybody, including William Casey, with my flip-flops on. That was great. So that, that was my Middle East experience. And then in 1984, so we're 6 years later, I get asked to return to Africa, and they offer me a kind of a premier sort of account. I return. Soon after that, I become the South Africa actually wrong. Soon after that, I'm offered the opportunity to lead the South African leadership account, which was actually my first management job. And then after about a year of doing that, I become the South African manager and so forth and so on. So from that point on, I'm a manager of analysis, and I spent 3 years overseas in London in the early 90s in a liaison position. And I think it was that experience during which it was the first Iraq War that I was involved in. And it was that experience, I think, that got me to be a lot more introspective about analysis. And I really began to understand between 10 and 15 years into my career that there were lots of problems with intelligence analysis. And we'll get into that. I'm not going to interrupt my chronology about that.
You can. If you want to go for it, go for it.
Well, I mean, it had to do with, there's so many issues. We'll tackle those separately.
Okay, cool.
So I come back. What happens a lot in any large organization is when you leave the mothership, reentry is difficult. They forget you. And I had a hard time getting back into the analytic stream. and to get hired for the kind of job that I thought I was ready for. And also, this critique had been building in my mind about the future of analysis. And it was after the Cold War. And there was a lot of Sturm und Drang and angst about, what do we do now that we're not analyzing the Soviet Union? I mean, it's hard to imagine how traumatic that really was for intelligence analysts. And I become cynical and negative. I mean, that's what people call me. You're cynical and negative. And I'm not a cynical or negative person, but I obviously projected that. And that got me into trouble in terms of my competitiveness for other positions. But I finally got a position in 1998 involved with improving the security of our products that were constantly being leaked, and also exploring digital technologies to see how that might revolutionize the way we did our work. And that was what I wanted to do, because that was one of the reasons why I was tagged cynical and negative, because I was like, Cassandra, the internet is going to change everything for all knowledge organizations. We are a knowledge organization. We must begin to adapt. And nobody wanted to hear that, or almost nobody. I mean, it was an amazing thing. And when I look, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, when you say no one wanted to hear that, is that because internally it was, I think I've heard you speak about this before, that it was kind of the complete opposite of the culture at CIA?
It was heretical. The
Sure.
CIA is built on secrets. The CIA is not built on easy access to information. And what the stupid thing that I did was that I didn't think it through, and I didn't realize that of course they were not going to hear me, because the internet was against the prevailing orthodoxy. And, organization easily accepts new ideas, particularly those that are clearly antithetical to the prevailing orthodoxy. But I finally got this job in 98, and I succeeded with the help of a lot of great people. And I finally entered the Senior Intelligence Service, which is, the equivalent of being a flag officer, which was my goal, I guess. And I became an analytic manager of large groups. And after 9/11 and after the failure on Iraq EMD analysis, there was a new CIA director, Porter Goss, and he had the mandate to just clean up analysis. And the story that they told me, Porter Goss's assistants told me, is that they interviewed, dozens of senior managers in the analytic directorate, of which I was now one. And he said, they told me that you were the only one who said that there were real problems with intelligence analysis. I'm just quoting what they said. And I was like, really? How can that be? How could I be the only one? And so so that's how I became deputy director of analysis. I was actually fleeted up. I skipped like 2 levels to do that, or maybe 1.5 levels. And I did that for a couple of years. I wanted to do it longer, but I was asked to take on another job. And I don't often talk about this part, but there was a change, and the new deputy director of the CIA was like, well, you're just not hard enough as a manager. And I consider that a compliment, because my goal was never to be hard. And it reflects some kind of what I think of as an old idea of what an effective manager is. But then I became the director of the Center for the Study of Intelligence, and was doing a bunch of special projects for General Hayden. But, that sort of determined me that I was going to retire as soon as I was eligible, which was when I was 55. I turned 71 next week, and I retired. I went to work for Deloitte for 5 years. I still have my clearances, So over the years, I've done some things for the intelligence agencies, spoken in public, and currently served on boards. And currently I'm on the Public Interest Declassification Board, which is a board jointly appointed by the President of the United States and Congress to think about to ensure as best it can that the classified materials are declassified in a timely fashion for the public interest. And there's actually a blog for the Public Interest Declassification Board. And if the government shutdown doesn't interfere, we are actually having a public session at the end of October. Sort of the things that we need to think about now that the documents linked to the 9/11 disaster are becoming eligible for declassification. So there's actually a law in the United States that all classified documents must be declassified 25 years after their date. But there's, pages and pages of exceptions and, got us in the details. And sometimes agencies, for good reasons, pay more attention to the exceptions than to the spirit of the law, one could say. So I've continued to write. I wrote a book, as you mentioned, Rebels at Work, about my experience being kind of a heretic in a large organization. I co-wrote it with Lois Kelly. I'm remain very interested in analysis, and most occasionally will put my mind together to do something on an analytic problem. I'm kind of mulling one over right now, so we may kind of discuss it while when we continue the conversation. But most of my new content, I've decided that YouTube, visual content is kind of where we're going. And so I have a YouTube channel where we post one interview with an interesting person on average once a week, where we just try, I think like you all are trying to have really interesting conversations on important topics.
Well, thank you for being so open and taking us through that. I was surprised at some of the things you said. I don't think I've heard you speak about them before, especially like your decision to leave, the thing about not being hard enough. It strikes me that,
I usually don't talk about that one.
Yeah. You should strike me as somebody who's very robust and very kind of, you can't be that critical. And anyway, we'll leave that to one side. Okay. So I'll explain a little bit about the pod and then why I'm leading up to this question about intel analysis, right? So I'll be honest, when I had kind of an interesting childhood and I ended up in the police I kind of skipped a bit of academia along the way. I had to go back and retrain. So I've always had a little bit of imposter syndrome, right? Mm. And so when I got into intel, I basically wanted to go into the fundamentals because the way I combat imposter syndrome is I try and go to what are the fundamentals, the first principles, who are like the big thinkers in that space. And I've tried to really do a deep dive into intel analysis. And intel analysis is a long story, right? Because obviously we go back all the way to the 40s and the Bill Donovan setting up the Center for Research and Analysis. We have Sherman Kent, and then this evolution of this thing that we call intelligence analysis, big I, big A. And I'll be honest, sometimes I found it quite a obscure subject, because I think sometimes if I was to take a random sample of biologists from around the world, chances are they'd probably speak in the similar ways about similar things and have similar experiences. If I do other certain types of professions, I would have the same thing. But I think intel analysis, now granted I have a law enforcement in the UK bias, but I tend to find that when you talk about intel analysis in a global context, if you were to grab a random sample of intel analysts from across the globe, and sometimes this changes over time, right? You wouldn't necessarily get a lot of similarity in their speech, in their work, in their outlook. And that to me says that intel analysis isn't like a very specified forensic thing. If this, do this. It's more of a broad area. And I just wondered if you could take us through your take on intel analysis for an audience that maybe are not from the Intel community or not from our background?
So, I agree with everything you said. Before I try to offer my own definition is not the right word.
Sure.
But my own description of intelligence analysis. I'm sure you know Stephen Marin. He's at an important university here in Virginia, and he was an analyst at CIA. And I remember he would come to talk to me. You've looked up his university affiliation, and it is...
I'm Googling it now, trying to find it for you. Just failed miserably. Hang on, because there's too many Stephen Marins.
Come on, you're an intelligence analyst. You should have it at your hands. Open source, get on with it.
James Madison University, JMU.
Forgive
James
me.
Madison.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was an analyst, and I remember him coming to me with all of these papers and ideas and thought pieces he was writing about what was wrong with intelligence analysis. And he would show them to me because, by reputation, I was one of the managers that was receptive to these ideas. And that's when he developed an idea very similar to what you were saying, that, are we really a discipline? Are we really a profession? Because we're not like doctors, we're not like you said, everybody would be sort of speaking from the same script and they would be interchangeable, right? And we're not like that at all. And so I agree with everything you said. So how would I describe intelligence analysis? Well, there's one category of intelligence analysis that most people, when they use that phrase, are referring to, which is individuals who are cleared to go through all the secret information that the government collects, to make sense of it and use it to answer the questions that policymakers have, and use it to warn policymakers about problems that might be emerging and altogether too rarely could use it to help policymakers identify opportunities. And this is all based on these categories of ints that have been developed largely since World War II. And that's one definition.
That's like humans, SIGINT. We say ints.
Yeah, human, SIGINT, ELINT, MESINT, now OSINT. Drives me nuts. Open source intelligence. This description of intelligence analysis, the one that I just described or articulated, was attempting to be so precise and so self-contained that when the internet came out and all the other information in the world that was available, that had always been available, but now was practically accessible, when all that information became usable, intelligence agencies all over the world, in the United States, and I imagine all over the world, have argued whether or not intelligence analysts should use open source. I consider this the most ridiculous conversation. I understand why it happens bureaucratically, but it is an absurdity. And I just recently saw something over the interwebs, maybe on LinkedIn, where I think it was some kind of U.S. military intelligence activity had put out an official policy saying that it was okay for the Intel analysts to research open source. And I was like, what? So this continues.
Sure.
But that's that one definition of intelligence analysis.
At that point, can I just...
So description, yes, please.
I think because I've heard you speak about this before in other lectures, I think you've done an exercise in the past where you talk to your students about there's everything that can be known about a situation in a room.
Yeah.
And obviously, and in your example, maybe the secret intel is one box.
Yeah.
But in what you've just explained, right, it's the whole notion that you have to give permission to look at the rest of the room, right?
Exactly. Well put.
Yeah,
it's absurd. And so it was admittedly kind of late in my career. I'm embarrassed, but it wasn't probably until after 2000, let's say, that I had this realization that we look at that flow of secret or secretly acquired information or proprietary information that comes across our computer inboxes as an intel analyst in government. And the big assumption that we're making is that this information flow accurately represents reality. And I don't remember the exact moment, but I remember the feeling I got when the thought entered my mind, oh my God, it doesn't accurately represent reality at all. And even worse, we don't even understand how much of reality it does represent. Does that classified information flow represent 10% of reality or 30% of reality? And I don't care, except for maybe a few small domains like, biological, chemical warfare programs or something like that. It's a single digit number in terms of what percentage of reality it represents. And yet we take that information and we massage it and we draw conclusions from it and we present it to our policymaker customers as if it is an accurate representation of reality.
Like it's a forensic DNA test, right?
Like it's a forensic DNA test. And I was like, this is the most absurd thing. So it's one of the things, that's why I use the example that you mentioned all the time with analysts. I would ask them, okay, imagine this room represents everything that an omniscient God would know about Al-Qaeda. At the time, that was the example I used. What part of the room represents what we actually know, we being the CIA or the Counterterrorism Center? I had one guy once just hold up his coffee cup. This is it. So this is a fundamental flaw is not the right word, but it's a fundamental defect in this concept of intelligence analysis. So, but I think this is sort of the operational definition that runs all government for the most part. I mean, there are some changes, but that runs a lot of government intelligence organizations. So, but intelligence, as the modern world has become more complex, more and more companies, institutions realize that they need some activity whose singular purpose is to organize and make sense of all the information that activity needs to be aware of to operate effectively in the world. Whether you are, staging live concerts,
sure,
whether you're a police force, whether you make refrigerators in Nebraska, it doesn't matter. There's a flow of information that you need to be aware of to make the best optimum decisions. And as the volume of information has exploded, and I would also argue the complexity of the world, I don't know that the world has become more complex, although I do think that the numbers have become higher. I think we just become aware of this complexity. I think that they realize with all this information that they just can't count on Joe, the chief operating officer of the sales division, to somehow magically absorb it all and have it in his mind as some kind of background that informs his decisions, that you can't count on Joe or Elizabeth to do this, and that you have to have a dedicated team to do it.
Well, I say because the world is big, complicated, and constantly changing every day. I think you spoke about before in a different lecture about how, I can't know if it was in the 80s or the 90s, but there was this idea that all analysts or case officers had to do was kind of read the inbox traffic, and they'd have their finger on the pulse of what's going on, but actually...
Yes, exactly. I mean, I can talk about this topic. I become a Daffy Duck on it, so I try to avoid that. So that activity, putting together some people whose sole purpose is to organize and make sense of the information flows that are important to your organization, to your mission. They have, I think, confusingly also been called intelligence analysts, right?
Absolutely.
Risk. Sometimes they're called risk. Sometimes they come under the security umbrella of their organization.
Intelligence as a word has been co-opted. The word analyst has been co-opted, and in conjunction.
Yeah.
And it's because I tend to find that there's people in those jobs and in those agencies, and they don't really perhaps think about too much about what the titles mean once they're in post. But I think sometimes when people leave the organizations and leave that world, and then they find themselves in a world where they have to market their transferable skills.
Right.
It sounds cool, right? You say, I'm an intelligence analyst at CIA, or I'm in law enforcement. And I think that's the problem, is that sometimes it's led to this over decades, people commodifying intelligence, commodifying analysis.
Right.
And now there's so much commodification over decades now that it feels like a meaningless term sometimes.
Yeah, it does feel like a meaningless term. And now we've got the big bad AI coming, or maybe it's the big good AI coming. And I was brought into conversations, let's say 3 years ago, about, the impact of AI on intelligence analysis. And I said to one person, if you give, and this is 3 years ago, if you give an AI engine a thick set of documents, i.e. you control its inputs, they sift through it, and it sifts through it, identifies patterns, anomalies. It can do all this sort of basic organizational, what I call categorization of the information so fast and just as good as any analyst, as any human analyst can. And this is the kicker. And then I said, and frankly, I think for maybe 50% of our analysts, that's all that they really can do professionally. Because we didn't have AI. So we hired people who were good researchers, who could filter large dumps of information quickly and reliably and pick out what was new and interesting and put things into category. And so AI can do that. And we're just silly if we don't accept that that's what AI can do. So, but by my estimation, that unemploys 50% of intelligence analysts in large government organizations. The group that's the group that I was talking about. So, I think that the human mind is an incredible thing. And I think we have incredible capabilities beyond that categorization. I actually think that, categorization is in the scale of things an analyst or sense maker, putting whatever word you want to put in there, can do. Categorization is manual labor. It's really important manual labor, but on the hierarchy of things, value-added things we can do, it's still manual labor.
I'm with you 100%. I'll be honest, in my agency, but even privately, I think the AI tools, the large language models specifically, I've seen them automate many of the things you describe quite well. I mean, it's interesting, right? You look at LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is either AI will save us all and it's amazing, or if we build it, we're all dead.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also seen a lot of kind of dubious content about whether it can, I say replace the analyst. I think it can replace some of the analytical function.
Exactly.
I'm not suggesting it can replace the entire analyst, but actually, me and Howard have played with this. When you feed it certain types of data, it's quite good sometimes at parsing large volumes of information,
right.
Doing some very rudimentary judgments, and you kind of think you might give that to a junior analyst and I think if you can automate that, well, actually, it's the same story of automation, right? In that, okay, now we don't have to do it all. We can get the computer to do some of it for us. That doesn't mean we abandon everything. We can still do some stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry, Howard. I know I've been a monopoly. Go on, Howard. Sorry.
Wow. What a lot of gold in terms of insight and perspectives. Carmen, thank you. I'll touch on the intel and analysis bit first, just to kind of close that bit off, because we could talk on that for years before I get into the management stuff. I love the idea. You use a phrase that Mark knows I use a lot, sense-making. Like you, I've had a journey. Now I'm 68. I'm a little bit younger than you.
Oh, you're a puppy.
Only just, of which 50 years has been a career in, 34 in law enforcement and then beyond. But my law enforcement career was far more than just law enforcement. I've worked all over the world. I've worked with every level of organisation. If you wanted to do a diagram of the various intel structures within organisations and the differences, what you might call the state intelligence services, the special interest groups, big data movers, private sector, I've interfaced with most of them at some point with the work that I've done, including the private sector and the big non-law enforcement organisations. And I say law enforcement with a small L and a small E. What that's taught me, like Mark, I started out I wanted to learn about this process because I'm a great believer in humanity and human skills. But what really interests me is how we collect and process information to inform decision-making, whether we're the ones making the decision or we're in helping somebody else. So the phrase sense-making is music to my ears, because I hate, and I've been as guilty as anyone, of coming up with and teaching definitions. And every time I come up with them, you think it's not complete or it's not appropriate for every sector. So I've gone through the full swing of the bell curve from early practitioner student to be practitioner, to be manager, to be writer and sort of thought process leader, shall we say, to try and make a difference in my profession, to realising it's not a science. It's maybe somewhere between an art and a philosophy. But in that situation, you can, if you accept that, that gives all of us the chance to A, contribute, B, to bring into the broad church of intel and analysis all the outlying organisations and players, but also to plan and be ready for the future, because the moment you come up with a definition, it's a definition at a moment in time, and tomorrow's data is going to be a different problem for the intel analysts of tomorrow and organisations to deal with. One of the things that you said early on was this idea that you were having problems being seen as difficult. And that really echoed with me. I was always a company man, and law enforcement in the UK certainly, but perhaps more so than America, it's very structured. It was built on quasi-military structures, rank, and this idea of seniority or superior. Your superior was superior. No, they're not. They're just higher managers than me, managing bigger pots of resources, maybe with bigger problems to solve. Doesn't mean they're superior mentally or ethically or physically even. Says he as a fat bloke from, a fat old man. But one of the things that I always got as a company man, like you, I came from a scientific background. That was my graduate training before I joined the police. And I joined the police because it gave me a job when science couldn't give me a job. It was the way of the world. You got to put a roof over your head and food in your belly. But my skill throughout my service has been my ability to assimilate and assess information from any source. And within law enforcement, organisationally and legally, there are restrictions put on that. Culturally, they certainly are. Everything you talked about, I recognise all of that. But my start point as what you might call a human being and as an analyst is no data is out of bounds. And as you say, from a scientific point of view, if you've only got a small sample of a large population of data, even if you've got 100% of all the data in one form, but none of the data in other forms, and Mark and I have discussed large language models and the limitations of that data set, even if it was 100% of that data, the system's blind to other data. What I've always found is I always thought my role and that of my teams was to, like you say, make sense of the information to inform and alert more senior managers or organisational reps who had the role and the responsibility to make decisions but didn't have the time or the skill set to properly assimilate the data to do so. We don't make the decisions, but we pull the levers that make the decisions. And I always found the way to do that was to recognise their limitations and always manage the managers. An effective intelligence analyst,
yes, absolutely,
has to manage their managers and try and, like you talked about, predicting every outcome in a debate. You're predicting how the discussion will go and how you would respond, because you're dealing with sometimes human sensitivities and frailties, sometimes organisational and cultural, and you can't let that divert your role and your duty to that scenario, that group discussion, from what your role is, which is to deliver the information and reassure people that you've thought about these things. You're not telling them the decision to make, but you're telling them what they need to think about and the bits that are more important and what they might lead to and not. So you're almost doing some of their thinking for them. And in that situation, I mean, I'm a company man. I've never been one to go outside. But like you, in my career, I reached a point where I thought, everybody's as bad. They really don't get this. And there's a resentment that becomes a barrier to being an effective team player. Not from me or my team, but from the customers. And I've found it outside law enforcement since I left in the fields that I've worked in. And I always remember at one point in the police service, I was considering going for promotion. And in law enforcement, in the UK, there are certain grades where you become purely a manager rather than having any involvement in operational policing. And I never wanted to take that step because I liked being practically effective, as well as I had a lot of power in terms of influencing the key decision makers in the organisation, way above my rank, if you will. But one of my colleagues who'd gone through it says, well, Howard, you need to look at yourself. You are what we call a troublesome priest.
Oh, that's a great phrase.
You are this person who has a belief, an ethics, and an approach to duty that, whilst commendable, can cause us problems politically. Not that you're going to go outside and be the rogue player for the team, but you sometimes raise uncomfortable data and uncomfortable questions that we don't want to consider. We ought to consider them, but 9 times out of 10 we don't want to. So we kind of want you for when the proverbial brown stuff hits the fan, but the rest of the time when we're playing our little interdepartmental and interorganisational games and politics and even interpersonal, we don't want to go there. So we need you, but you're never going to be that kind of influencer because you're not prepared to play the game when actually it's against what the weight of the data and the reasoning shows. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
I found since I left, I've been like you, I was always and still am. Like you've still got your clearance. Mine's probably expired for law enforcement. It's different to the security services. But certainly I've maintained some of my other professional links and skill sets and access. And legally I'm still bound. We have something over here, you'll know about it, the Official Secrets Act. Mm-hmm. That lives with me till the day I die. I don't have an issue with any of that. I would never breach any of that. It's hardwired into me. But in the right setting with the right people who are out to listen to and hear what I say, I can speak up. But even outside of all of that, I feel much freer now to be able to critique, but in a positive, I'm not coming from a place of negativity.
Right.
As a law enforcement officer, as a UK police officer, I carried a badge for 34 years. I am tremendously proud of what the best of us do in that job. I'm proud of what I did, what my teams did. But Mark will tell you, I'm known here in the UK as one of the biggest critics of the police. Not because I'm anti-police. It's because I see areas where it's making organisational systemic mistakes that could be easily fixed. And they're blind to it. Sorry, Mark.
No, I just wanted. So, if you finish off, if you've got something, if you want to carry on.
No, it was just, even though we come from very different Intel worlds, I don't think we do. I think we're all part of this big Venn diagram where we go off into specialisms. But there are certain values and approaches in terms of how we collect and collate and use data to then reason and form reasoned outcomes that are common, like whether that, like you say, you're the guy on the production line at Ford, or whether you're in the CIA, or whether you're in a local health authority, or whether you're flipping burgers at McDonald's. Even human beings, the decisions, what clothes you buy, where you go on holiday, which route you take to work, what kind of car you buy, they are all survival-based or values-based decisions. So every human being is an analyst.
Right.
So some of us, some of us naturally are sort of self-introspective to realise that, hey, there's a process going on I'm not aware of, kind of like breathing. Most of us don't think about breathing. Most of us don't think about thinking and how we analyse data for information. So what I was going to ask you was, so I've been going on about that, Mark. Sorry.
It's all right, but it's fine, Dory.
What I wanted to ask you, this troublesome priest idea, which is what you are another Howard in that, or I'm another Carmen. In the role of managing analysts, and I have the book.
Yeah.
It's full of underlining pencil bits and other things. It's one of my go-tos because I believe in transformational leadership and transformational organisations. It's future-proofs them in ways that others do not. And no matter, it's also better for the people inside. But the prime goal is it better prepares the organisation to defend itself and survive going forwards, rather than transactional leadership. What's in it for me? What's in it for us? When you've gone through all that process, the problem for us as Intel managers or Intel analysts, we're all one group, is persuading our customers, our clients, of the value of our product when there's this natural cultural aversion sometimes, and even personal, to putting it to use. And that's quite a different skill set, because you may be a great analyst coming up with products, and they're really good products. But if you haven't got the ability to communicate it and kind of rightfully sit at the round table of decision-making and have an influence, you will fail. Good product, bad communication is failure. How have you found that in your career at different times? Are there any particular features that you would emphasise to would-be Intel operatives to actually be effective communicators and therefore effective operatives in this team game?
That's a difficult question, and I have not been as successful as I would have wanted to be. I will tell you a few things that come to mind. Aviation, a field that I read about a lot because I think there's a lot of lessons for intelligence organizations in aviation. And when you talk to a pilot about particularly a long-haul flight, what it's like to be a pilot, they say it's like 95% total boredom and 5% sheer terror. And I think that applies in a slightly slanted way to being an intelligence analyst. So we have to train the people that we hire to develop their sophisticated thinking skills. And the fact that none of us know how to define sophisticated thinking skills is a huge problem for us. Because if you can't define it, you can't teach it. If you can't describe it, you can't teach it. But I think the best we know is that if we give Joe 5 years of these experiences, the average Joe at the end of those 5 years of those experiences will be a pretty good intelligence analyst. I think that's kind of what we know organizationally. And so to make their job seem important to them, to motivate them, we create all these documents or briefings or findings or whatever, and we present them to policymakers. So we insist on presenting to our customers, our policymakers, 95% of the material, which is sheer boredom. That's really what we're doing. It's a very odd, bizarre situation. And so when we do that and the policymaker, she gets tired of the 95% of sheer boredom stuff, she becomes immune and therefore is unable to process when the information is actually the 5% in the 5% sheer terror category. So I think we've always had this problem, and this is a very practical problem being a manager of an intelligence organization. We've always had this problem of how do we train them to be of a high enough quality of intelligence analysts, which incidentally we can't actually define in a rigorous way. How do we train them and keep them motivated if they don't feel some satisfaction that they are being recognized by their customers as providing some kind of an important service? And AI is just going to make this problem worse. Because you already, and this I consider quite a valid point about AI, and I don't know how to solve it, but a lot of people say, well, the problem with having AI do all this sort of manual labor part of the intelligence analysis work is how are we going to train our new analysts? You know, they have to learn, they have to start somewhere in learning how to be a more discerning thinker. And if we take away all this rudimentary stuff from them, exactly what's going to happen? I don't have an answer for that. I think that's a real problem. One of the reasons why we lose influence, or we don't have the influence we should have with our policymakers, is that we inflict upon our customers all the training data. Can't reimagine that model. Okay. How would it work? I mean, I think I could reimagine it in different ways. I think we all could reimagine it in different ways. The thought that entered my mind was, what if we, you know, which is actually something that I was trying to do at CIA. What if we're writing for each other? And then your colleagues sort of vote up or vote down a piece, and somehow your rewards at the end of the year reflect how your colleagues thought of your work. I know I can hear all the objections to that, but it's probably preferable to insisting to our policymaker that this piece on current events in Slovenia is really important for you to read when it so clearly isn't. There isn't anything new in there. So that's one thought I have. A second thought I have is, and this is drawn from a real lesson, we have to be psychologically way smarter about how we use language with policymakers in communicating our conclusions. Way, way smarter. I know now because since I left the CIA, I've read a lot into cognitive theory and all of these fields, which oddly enough, as a manager at CIA, I was never introduced to them. I mean, Sherman Kent, and if you know this name, Jack Davis, they were like the two people, the fonts of wisdom on intelligence analysis. And it's only when I left CIA that I realized, oh my God, there's this whole other huge discipline about cognitive models and how people receive information. And for example, you know, we spent all this time anguishing about whether it should be probably or most likely or whatever bizarre thing we're trying to dissect. And cognitive theory will tell you that it doesn't matter, that the person who reads it at the other end will absorb it at some much more fundamental level, that your choice of words makes no difference, right?
Absolutely.
So anyway, but so we're so, I recommend that all people who want to become analysts or analytic managers immerse themselves as much as they can in how our mind works, how our mind interprets information, and that will therefore inform them on how they communicate with their customers. You know, the value of graphics, the importance of images, the relative clunkiness of words, all of that has to be taken into account. But the one specific example I wanted to point out was, and I talk about this a lot, is our use of the phrase worst case scenario, which is endemic among analysts. And I know firsthand because I heard this from a policymaker, and we were talking, an important policymaker, and we were talking about the insurgency in Iraq. And after Saddam Hussein was overthrown, and the policymaker said, you didn't warn me about this. So that's the 5% of sheer terror, right? He didn't feel warned. And we said, au contraire, we did. So, number one, if you're arguing with the policymaker, you have already lost.
You've lost.
One of my favorite phrases is, if you're explaining, you're losing. That there's no explaining to win. You know, it's like, stop digging, please. Just stop the digging. Okay, so, but we said, oh no, but we did look. We here it is. We told you. And the policymaker says, oh, you said it was a worst case scenario. I'm quoting. And I went, but in the back of my mind, I was like, oh, when I write worst case scenario, the average human thinks unlikely. They are just, this is cognitive theory. They're immediately coupling those two things.
They're not trained intel officers. They're not from that background.
They're not from that background. When they hear worst case scenario, they go, that's like if all 4 tires on my car went flat at the same time. That's not going to happen, right?
Sure.
So I realized we got to stop using these phrases. And so this is not my idea, but when I talked to people about this, someone suggested, they said, yeah, I learned the same lesson. And now I just say most dangerous. The most dangerous outcome is X. I'm not sure in fact, I know that won't solve all these problems, but I do think that's a better formulation than worst case scenario. So best case, worst case, all of that should be obliterated from our vocabulary. Should all go away. Let me see. What more would you like me to say about this intel management? This is, communicating with customers. You've got to understand cognitive theory better. You have to you have to be more selective with the material you send your customers. You have to stop using the providing products to customers as the training ground for your new analysts, because you're just asking for irrelevance when you do that. And 3, you've got to be psychologically way smarter about how you use language and understand the limitations of language, because language is very, very clunky and open to constant misinterpretation.
That's absolutely brilliant. It matches exactly how I feel. One of the things that stands out is we had a guest on who is a very respected medical practitioner, being involved in, although medicine's his background, he found intel analysis as a medical practitioner was of value to him in dealing with major global medical issues, in his case Ebola and then COVID. And he's, again, from the US. Lovely guy, very insightful. But one of the things he said was, as a medical practitioner, when he communicated with his customers, the patients and clients, he was very limited in the information he gave, because he would have done loads of tests or maybe have lots of qualifiers that were going on in his head about the state of the diagnosis at that time based on the data that he had and potential outcomes. We're talking about people's life and death here. But he says, if I give that out to these people, they will run with it and maybe come to conclusions that are completely incorrect. And contraindicators, they're actually likely to do more harm to their health than not knowing. And I just thought that was such a great analogy for our world, where you're almost thinking, well, I've always been a great believer in, I agree with you totally. Don't put numbers, don't use phrases that other people misinterpret. I've always been a big fan of limiting what you say. I've always said you can have all the Intel databases, reports, you can put it in a fancy binder, loads of IT pictorials. It's all useful supplementary information. But the best and most effective delivery of intel to a decision maker is face to face, where they say, well, what do you think? You say X. Literally one phrase. You know, what's the most significant? And I like significance and risk rather than major threat or really, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I do.
Because you could have really significant data about a null theory. You know, I've done loads of work that proves that that group are not likely to act in that way. There's no indication that they're doing anything. And the manager will say, well, why are you telling me that? Because it means you don't need to divert resources and attention to that right now in terms of operational intervention. But that doesn't mean you give up looking at them or collecting data and managing that potential risk, because we know there's a potential risk. And that links me back to, I remember watching one of your presentations on analytic heuristics, which I love. And I'll freely admit I have stolen, citing you, and delivered it very effectively, my own take on that, to UK intelligence managers, and very receptive. So you might have got a few more hits than from the UK. But one of the things that you said in there was this idea when you're talking about creating what in law enforcement we would call a jeopardy surface, where you've got this basically a landscape of the data, where you're using that landscape to direct. In your case, if I remember correctly, it was the kind of the flight paths of various aircraft.
Right.
In law enforcement, we would use that to direct the patrol route of foot officers or vehicles. You know, the statistical probability of dropping on something or being of service. That really stood out to me as a good way to have this conversation.
I want to say just a few things about what you just said, Howard. One of the things I would say as intelligence managers, I would say we are just too hung up on our products. If we have an effective relationship with our customer, the sign of a really good relationship with our customer is when we can answer their question or provide what they need in like a couple of sentences. They don't want a huge paper. And we shouldn't insist on providing it, although we often do for our own internal bookkeeping reasons. So, you know, if the policymaker asks you, how are things going in Slovenia? And you say, you need to become, I am more worried. And I think you need to, hopefully you've been part of their, contingency planning. And I think it's time for you to think about some of the steps in, contingency plan B. That's really all you need to say. You don't need to say the other stuff. And in aviation, one of my favorite examples, in the modern airplanes, when it becomes a moment of sheer terror, when it becomes a 5% moment, the modern airplanes totally change the instrumentation the pilot sees. Because usually the pilot has all the stuff that can distract him or her. But when it's, they've lost an engine or it's a demonstrable moment of emergency, the screens go blank and the only thing the pilot sees are the 3 or 4 critical inputs he or she must see at that moment. That's a tremendous lesson for intelligence analysts. Not one which I don't think we have absorbed, because we're caught up in this dynamic that we think we have to justify our existence. And that is a dynamic that exists. And we think we justify our existence by doing more. And that's, I think, the problematic conclusion that we're drawing.
I really agree with you. That's a really good take on where I was coming from. Can I ask you a different question?
Sure.
One of the things I've always valued in UK law enforcement, because we're not military, like America, we're a civilian police force, and we represent the public. We are employed to enforce and deal with issues of law as one of our roles by the public, who through democracy, Parliament, our political leaders, decide what the law should be. We don't get to decide that. But one of the things that UK law enforcement says is we want to reflect society. So we want our personnel to come from all sectors of society, be that race, religion, age, culture, creed, nationality. Now, that's something I've always believed in strongly as a manager, especially as an intel manager, because if you're going to go out and go fishing amongst data sets that are new and unknown, rather than having 100 analysts, all of whom think the same way and do the same job with the same kind of data, comms data, for example. If somebody said to me, and I've had it, what would you do if you got more staff? I tell you, give me somebody from a different background. Give me somebody from completely outside who will maybe not only look at what we do with new eyes, but make us look in areas at data or perspectives on data that we don't hold. And I've always found that strength in a varied team. But the downside of that as a manager is you often have to juggle and create comfort zones and places where all these staff with all their personal and cultural and whatever other factors come together and can play. It's like a safe working environment, kind of like a safe learning environment in teaching. They've got to feel comfortable to engage. And I wondered, obviously, you are from a very important and influential organisation with data sets and levels of access and resourcing and influence that we aren't from. But here you are, a highly successful leader and manager in your profession, proven by your record. You're a lady. I've often wondered with my teams. My first instructor when I was a police officer was a lady. She was my mentor. We have a 2-year process called probation, whereby this person takes you around and teaches you what the real job's about rather than what's in the book. And I still think now, 50 years later, of some of the perspectives that she had as a woman that we were both carried warrant cards, we were both police officers. She thought differently to the way that I thought as a man. And I'm not being sexist here. It's not about that. It's about different perspectives. And I wonder if you'd ever seen that, because you've clearly got a different perspective to myself and Mark, maybe because of sex, maybe because of age, maybe because of culture, maybe because of country, maybe because of sphere of influence, all of which is good. But has it ever made a difference to your work? Because it certainly has to mine and my effectiveness.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one experience that I talk a lot about, or have talked about, is when I worked on South Africa, I was during the decade that led to the end of apartheid. And I was the analysts, there's about 10 of them maybe, were pretty much equally divided as to whether or not they thought black majority rule could emerge as part of a more or less peaceful process. And the other half thought it was just going to be a horrific, bloody civil war. And I, as our manager, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the heck is the dividing line between these two groups. And one that I observed in an analog way, I didn't test them or anything, but one that I observed was that the ones who were optimistic about black majority rule were just generally optimists by nature. They were optimists about everything. And the ones who were pessimistic about black majority rule were just pessimists by nature. So, lesson, you can't help but bring your prevailing cognitive style, your prevailing personal psychology, however that develops, and we don't know, into your work. And it interprets it affects the way you interpret data. So that was one issue. But I eventually had a colleague call out when this is a colleague who had been part of the pessimist group. Bob Gates actually was interested in his view. He goes and takes a trip to South Africa, comes back, actually writes a memo that says, I think Carmen's right. I think things are changing there in ways that we don't quite understand. And because this guy had a lot of ego, he's a dear friend of mine, but he has a lot of ego. He actually wrote, well, why didn't I see this when Carmen saw it? A topic, frankly, he did not have to address, but only because he had a lot of ego he felt he had to address. And he said, he actually wrote in the memo, maybe it's because I'm not Puerto Rican. And I remember reading that and going, oh my God, what is he saying? And then also reflecting on it. And I go, okay, well, I wish he really hadn't put it that way. But I mean, I can see how the sum total of my experiences might have made me more sensitive to indicators that he just simply overlooked. And, I'm a brown skin person, a term I actually almost never use because I kind of dislike it. I dislike all skin color references, period. But I, grew up never being particularly consciously aware of this, but nevertheless, subconsciously, it must have been part of my mentality. I grew up as part of a non-dominant group in whatever society I was in. Going to kindergarten in Georgia, going to third grade in North Carolina. And I could tell you little moments where it was clear that people were viewing me only through the color of my skin. It's very sad. But all that subconscious impact on my mind, amateur psychologist here, probably contributed to my ability to pick up things about the Black resistance that members who had dominating life experiences would never have picked up on. This is really annoying them and they are really getting mad, kind of stuff, right?
Is this like non-verbal cues or more written stuff, or what? Is this non-verbal cues, do you mean?
It could be it could be non-verbal cues. I'll tell you one in specific, which involves actually the European community. I remember one of the events that I placed a huge importance on was somewhere in maybe 1985, there was a garbage worker strike in Port Elizabeth. And it went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And to the point where the European City Council decided we've got to solve this. So they actually sat down and negotiated face to face with the leaders of the colored and Black garbage workers unions, whatever they were. And I remember reading this and I go, wow, this is significant. The fact that the Europeans are sitting down as basically equals with the colored and Black leaders of the labor union is going to have an impact. It tells you something about the European mentality shifting, and it will have a huge impact on the colored and Blacks. Those are the terms they use in South Africa. The coloreds and Blacks' perception of their own power and what they can achieve. Now, I'm not like reinventing history. That's actually what I thought at the time. I would tell people this and they would just dismiss it. People who had always been part of whatever the dominant culture was in their group, they say, oh, that's not important at all. But for me, I interpreted it completely differently.
What really stands out to me, that's music to my ears, is that regardless of the issue, good intelligence operatives, good analysts, almost have a sixth sense by whatever their training and background or natural skill set is and their life experiences, to be sensitive to data that's maybe marginal, questionable, not clear. The number of times I've looked at something and thought, there's some kind of pattern here. I don't know what it is. I don't know what significance it is, but there's something. And it's kind of like, well, we've got two lines of inquiry here. One, let's go out and find out, is there a pattern because it's an anomaly in the way that we collect the data or the sample that we've taken? Or two, is the potential pattern, the meaning in it, a real pattern? And what does it mean? Because patterns in data don't get interpreted always. We anthropomorphize data sometimes when it's not actually related to anything of, shall we say, human interest. So that's music to my ears. And that kind of goes back to my argument of you need this variety of thought in a team to be effective in this group, because often our customers won't be. I'll give you one example, and this is one I've shared with Mark, but never in this context. Many years ago, as a detective and a trainer, I was tasked, and I'm going back to the days of apartheid in South Africa, I was tasked with a group of carrying out an attack on a South African bank. They'd built a new security system, and they came to us through UK military and government services to say, would you attack it and see if you can break our security? Bear in mind, we're sat in the middle of England, many thousands of miles away. And we broke it within about 8 hours. And they went nuts. I said, well, how did you break it? We've got all this sophisticated physical security, IT security systems, barriers, cameras. All we'd done, we'd identified a chap who was a cleaner at the bank, a very low-grade employee, and they had a certain level of security pass. And we paid this individual a small amount of rands, a fortune in his world, but we basically bought his access. And they said, well, you've cheated. You've attacked, you've gone round the back. And I said, well, if you asked us to attack the castle, only a fool would attack the walls. The fact that we found a little back door, your potential opponents, criminals, will do the same. But what really surprised me was at the time, they weren't as much offended about the way that we'd done that we'd not attacked what they wanted us to attack, test their security, new systems, or the walls, the shields. But the fact that we'd gone to a working class, black South African cleaner, lovely guy, well, how could that person be involved? He wasn't on their radar, and this was the big lesson we tried to take back to them. You're not looking in the right place.
Yes, you're not asking the right questions.
Crime or influence as a business is about finding the most efficient route and the unexpected routes. And if you're not thinking like that, you will fail as a business. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Mark.
No, I just want to go back to Carmen's point about her colleague saying, why didn't I see that? Because I think that's an important point that underpins a lot of what we've been talking about today. I'm going to try and keep it succinct as I can. There's a little bit of a short walk to the point I'm going to try and make, but stick with me. So basically, Carmen, about 10, 15 years ago, I worked for Howard John Howard's team. I was in a similar situation where Howard actually had to take me to one side and said, look, you are making a lot of correct predictions, but you're just saying them, and you're not. And I don't really need a psychic analyst. I need an analyst who can explain to me why they think what they think. Because I was quite passionate in sometimes people would say something and I would say, well, it's obvious. And truth be told, I didn't understand enough my own thought process then. When I think about what you were saying about your experiences, there is a Victorian lady called Constance Naden. If you ever have a chance to, I don't know if you've come across her work before. She's a very criminally overlooked philosopher from the Victorian England. She was basically the Daniel Kahneman of her day. She's called Constance Naden. She was a philosopher and a poet, but she basically, in the same way Kahneman came up with a binary model of system 1 and 2, she had a slightly different take on it, and this is back in 1890. She said that human beings have two fundamental ways of processing things. They have cognition and recognition. Cognition is where you come across something that you've never really experienced before, and your mind plays with it and tries to kind of make it make sense because it's unusual and it's new. Recognition or recognition is where you think you know what it is and you kind of categorize it and you file it. But she said that basically these two things are in interplay all the time. And they are two distinct separate processes, but it's not one than the other. They can kind of feed off each other because the world is complex, right? There are things coming in. So her system 1 and 2 were completely different. Her system 1 and 2 were stuff I've seen before, stuff I've never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
And when you were talking about your example, I'm thinking, what is it that you've seen before? And you were talking about little anecdote,
Mm-hmm.
the kind of not the literal writing on the wall, but the kind of the metaphorical writing on the
Mm-hmm.
wall, the signals and stuff you were picking up. And I wonder if that's what was happening. I wonder if that's why your colleague didn't see it. It was because in some ways there was no way, he had not been on your life journey.
So he had never seen it before. Yeah.
He couldn't recognize so his he might be a very bright guy, super experienced, very intelligent, but essentially it was all cognition to him, not a lot of recognition, where perhaps your process was probably more recognition than cognition.
Yeah, that's very powerful. I will say, you were talking about how you couldn't explain why you thought what you thought, and I couldn't convince my colleagues that this Port Elizabeth moment was important, significant. And it wasn't until 5 years later, when I started reading about complexity theory, that I finally had the intellectual structure that could explain why this is significant. That significant change can start from very small things, but if enough of these small things happen, you have a step change into a totally different level of activity. That I didn't have that language 5 years earlier because I just didn't know it, right? And that's another reason why intelligence analysts have to remain current on so many fields beyond whatever their particular domain is. And it frustrates me to no end that most of them don't. They're just not curious enough.
Well, I think this goes back a little bit to your concern about AI, right? Because for me, I think, I say this as a UK law enforcement who I've never worked for CIA. I'm completely divorced from perhaps true intelligence analysis. I can only speak about intelligence analysis as I see it. But from my perspective, intelligence analysis, if done honestly, is kind of like a battleship with many roles performed by many crews.
Yes.
So the notion that you could have one analyst, you might be able to perform every duty on that ship, but not at the same time.
Right.
And there's going to be so for instance, you might be great at digging into data. You might be great at kind of you're coping with boredom and parsing difficult things. You might be a great communicator. There's all sorts of different strengths and weaknesses there. And I'll be honest with you, a few years ago, I kind of shared this with Howard and said, look, I'm not entirely sure intelligence analysts should be a thing. And what I mean by that is, without a fundamental redesign about what's going on in intelligence analysis in our circles, this omni-trained analyst, this omni-aware present, it can't happen. I think intelligence analysis, the function can happen. I think organizations have to be very mature about how they steer that battleship and who's on the bridge and who's in the engine room. But the notion that one individual can do that, I see that's where AI can potentially plug in, because maybe you can configure that, right? Maybe you can say, right, we can account for these different roles. And I think I'm somewhat more optimistic about AI than some of our colleagues are, because yes, I'm with you 100%. I think a lot of governments will say, we can fire half the analysts. I mean, when Howard and I were in post, we had analysts that all they ever did was put dots on maps.
Right.
That's what their role was.
We've all seen it.
Yeah. And they were the first to go, right, when the tech matured. I wonder if maybe the base level thinkers in intelligence analysis, they are the dots on maps folk who are about to go, maybe.
Yeah.
Time-wise, do you have enough time to go into the idea that you wanted to talk about, or would you prefer to start for
I don't. I think that my idea would be very difficult to develop in 10 minutes. But I will say,
I'm really sorry about that. That's our fault entirely.
It's consistent with what you just said, which is I've been thinking about what are all the different roles that you need in a successful intelligence analytic team, or rather, what are all the different types of expertise and knowledge that you need in a successful team? So obviously you need, I'm using the image of the pipe. You need the person who understands the pipe, who knows everything about the pipe. But you also need people who really understand well the environment that the pipe is sitting in. And there's like several stages of that environment. There's the conventional environment. There's the environment that everyone thinks about when you think about where that pipe is. But there's like the further afield environment, something that's going to happen next year that's going to be a brand new thing, but it's going to affect the pipe. And so you could keep going with these layers and layers and layers of people that you need to use their knowledge to understand what's going on with the pipe. And that's really the idea that I want to develop, because I've said many times that a good intelligence analyst is part of a good intelligence analyst team, that you can't separate these two concepts. But I was thinking I really need to spell that out in a little bit more detail. So that's kind of what I had. But there's a lot there.
If you have time to come back one day, we'd love to have you back, and then maybe we can explore that. But is there anything else you want to say in closing before we wind this up?
No, other than that, I really enjoyed it. It's always reassuring to talk to people who see what you see, understand from your perspective, and yet offer some other angle as well.
Carmen, I can't thank you enough for coming on today's show. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, no.
I hope we speak to you again soon. Take care. And thank you to everybody that's listening. We'll speak to you again soon.